I just wanted to say thank you for joining us today. It was supposed to be a walkthrough of the exhibition with Peter and Marianne Friel, who's also here joining us. It was a way, we were hoping it would be a way for us to celebrate the first day of May, a way to celebrate this amazing exhibition with some experts in our own city. But in lieu of that, Peter graciously agreed to share some of his expertise and knowledge on the ideas of photography and experimental practices. And I thought I might walk you through what the show should feel like in actual absence of being able to walk through. So I have a presentation that I put together as a way for us to kind of virtually zoom in to this exhibition with a little bit of background on Lorna Simpson. And then Peter also has a presentation, and then we'll hear from our director of education, Christina Roberts, with a little bit of technical and some information and some history on the actual residency. And then Peter and I will have a couple questions for each other, and then hopefully we'll turn it to you to share some of your thoughts and some of your ideas. If you have weird and wonderful photos, experimental practice photos in your homes, we'd love to see them. My parents are here, so I'm also going to qualify that by saying, no baby photos is not what we're doing right now. And then we'll also, but I do appreciate that the Zoom format has allowed so many people to join us from around the country and also from Canada. So I'm excited to share this information with you. So with that, I am going to share my screen and get going with this presentation. So this exhibition came together within my first year here as the curator at the Fabric Workshop and Museum, as I started to dig into the exceptional collection that the Fabric Workshop has, because really our collection evidences some of the most important turning points in an artist's career. That is the legacy of the Fabric Workshop and Museum, and the collection is able to show us the many ways that a collaboration with our studio has changed the trajectory of an artist's career. And Lorna Simpson is a really great example of this. Prior to coming to the Fabric Workshop, she was, of course, an experimental photographer, and Peter and I will talk a little bit about that. And she was already kind of pushing the boundaries of the field already. But when she came to the Fabric Workshop, she came with this book, and it's called An Album of Fluid Motion. And on the left of the screen, you'll see something called Spilling Breaking Waves. And this whole book is really just this beautiful imagery of just motion and fluid motion. And one of the ways that I think Lorna was interested in working with the Fabric Workshop was kind of implying the presence of the body without showing the figure. And that's something that was really important to Lorna as she was developing her practice. And for her, she provided this really beautiful quote about water, and I would like to share that with you. The quote goes, "I wanted the viewer to experience the power of being mesmerized by water, stop dead, standing in the water. I don't want the title to refer to a religious experience, but really to the body and this experience of confronting water and all of its meanings." So with that in mind, let's relook at the installation. You'll see some glass etched cubes with shoes, implying that maybe you're on a path. But what also Lorna has been really great at doing is implying the body through fragments, little pieces, little memories. One of the things that Peter and I will talk about as well is implying the viewer. So as opposed to being a neutral observer and just looking at a photograph and accepting it, Lorna has repeatedly and consistently tried to challenge that idea by bringing you into the experience of the photograph, and Standing in the Water is a really great example of that. So when I was putting the exhibition together, I wanted to know, how do I show this turning point for an artist's career? And so I opted to show the work that came immediately after this residency, because we have the benefit of doing that. This piece was made in 1994, and it was the first time she worked with felt in a very considered way. But this exhibition view here shows you the work that came right after in 1995, and it was called the Public Sex Series. And it was a series of large kind of fragmented imagery of, again, no body, but the implied implication that there is somebody there. And I'll get into what that means. But this, and then there's text next to it. There's a landscape, and it's all these felt panels that come together in this larger photo. And what she did so well here, and some of the things, what she's known for is really giving you a sense of interiority, the sense of quietude, that you're contemplating this piece, but you have this inner voice that's trying to grapple with what you're seeing, and your inner voice gets louder and louder the closer you get and the more you question what you're looking at. So with that, I thought, in lieu of being able to be in the exhibition, I thought I would read to you some of the text that's right next to these felt pieces that Lorna included as part of the work. They're felt panels probably about this big, and it will give you a sense of how she contributes to that sense of interiority. This piece is called The Park, and it was made in 1995. And this is the text that is right next to it. Just unpacked a new shiny silver telescope, and we are up high enough for a really good view of all the buildings in the park. The living room window seems to be the best spot for it. On the sidewalk below, a man watches the figures from across the path. It is early evening. The lone sociologist walks through to observe the private acts in the men's public bathrooms. These facilities are men's and women's rooms back to back. He focuses on the layout of the men's room, right to left, basin, urinal, urinal, stall, stall. He decides to adopt the role of the voyeur and look out in order to go unnoticed and noticed at the same time. His research takes several years. He names his subjects A, B, C, X, Y, and O. He records their activities for now and their license plates, when applicable, for later. This piece is called The Rock, also made in 1995. Female trouble. Divine has just left home after an argument over a Christmas gift and storms out of the house. She is picked up on the highway by auto mechanic, parentheses, played by Divine. They approach a wooded area and have frantic sex on a mattress by the side of the road. The next panel reads, driving all day long has induced a hypnotic state upon both of us. It is definitely time to pull over. I recognize the state park that we are now in the middle of and can endure a few more minutes of this drive in order to find the same spot I went to last time I was here. Hoping that this search will not turn into another journey since I didn't make mental notes of my surroundings during my last visit. I'm ill prepared and not really wanting to appear too familiar with the area at the same time. I make an effort to this time to commit this trip to memory, but here we are, sick of driving. We get out of the car and start to hike to find a spot, and we'll probably replace the last one completely. Haven't seen any weekend hikers for a while, and since we are miles away from the rest stops, it seems plausible that we are not being patrolled. I ask, how's this? Is this secluded enough for you? And then we move from The Rock to The Fire Escape, also made in 1995. And then they ended up with the impressions on their skin in the shape of stripes. This piece is called The Car, also made in 1995. I can hear the voices of the couple arguing in the distance. It sounds as though they've entered an arcade, but only their voices have entered and linger for a while, even after they have passed the opening and continue on their way. The intensity of their voices indicates arguments, but I'm not really concentrating on them completely. It seems as though even if they had walked through, they would not have noticed the presence of anyone, let alone anyone having sex. It's around noontime. Other than that, and you can hear a pin drop in this echo chamber, an open car door, the perfect hour, the perfect opportunity. We get into the car, which becomes a small cramped room within a larger room. So I hope that brings you closer to the exhibition. The other aspect that we added to this exhibition was a little bit more about process, because one of the unique factors of the fabric workshop is the work gets made and then exhibited. So we wanted to show how this work got made and also really kind of bring you into some of the process things that you may not be familiar with. For example, what is a screen that goes into screen printing? What is a halftone? Those kind of little black dots that create shading and contouring. We also put a table down for all the books, including the Album of Fluid Motion and other books that might help you understand a little bit more about Lorna and the context in which she made work. And then in the back of the image, you'll see three components from three different artist boxes. And if you're not familiar, an artist box at the Fabric Workshop is basically a material archive. It's a time capsule of something that was of some of the kind of remnants, materials. Now it could be printed emails, it could be hints, it could be real truths, it could just be scraps of anything that help us understand the project. And we work closely with the education department to select three artist boxes that might help us also understand what went into Lorna Simpson's projects. And the artist boxes were Alison Rossiter, Lonnie Graham, and Carrie Mae Weems. And I believe Christina Roberts is going to talk a little bit about them, but we can, if not, we'll talk about them as a group. On the other side of the process lab, you'll see this kind of lone box. And this is really kind of the motivation for this talk today and future conversations about our exhibitions. In most 99% of the cases, we have an artist box for the project, that time capsule. But in the case of Lorna Simpson, we don't have one. And so we really thought carefully about how do we fill this artist box now? And these public programs and conversations with past project coordinators, with education staff, other experts like Peter really help us metaphorically and hopefully physically fill that artist box. So this conversation will hopefully prompt you to let us know what you would like to go into that artist box, what would help you understand this project differently. And Peter, if you're ready, I think maybe we'll just go right into your presentation and then we can open it up to a conversation if that works for you.
That's great. Can everybody hear me? Yes, good. Just give me a moment, please, to share my screen. Great. Can everybody see the work Counting by Lorna Simpson on the screen? Yes, good. Okay, well, thank you, Karen, for that wonderful tour of the exhibition. That was a real pleasure. And thank you to the Fabric Workshop for asking me to talk with you all today. I'm a big fan of the Fabric Workshop, and it's great to be here, even virtually with all of you. And I don't think Karen said this, but I just want to add that Lorna Simpson went on to use felt in her work for at least 20 years, actually more than that after her project at the Fabric Workshop. And so that, to me, that really exemplifies what is so special and great about the Fabric Workshop is that artists come sometimes with no ideas, sometimes with specific ideas about a project they want to work on. And it really can change the direction of their work, as Karen did say. So that happened with Lorna Simpson, and we might talk about some of that later work a bit later in the show. But I want to start with the work that just preceded Lorna Simpson's residency at the Fabric Workshop. This is a well-known work by her from 1991, which is more or less her breakthrough moment. She really started to come to notice in the late 80s and early 90s with pieces like this that pair pretty straightforward documentary photography with text. And often it's very basic text, as you see here. This piece is called Counting. We have three images, a partial view of a woman with her neckline and dress, a very small view of what seems to be an old building made out of brick, and then a hairpiece or a hair braid. And the texts are next to, adjacent to these pictures, sometimes seem to relate to them directly, sometimes don't. And they all involve numbers. You can see them as well as I do. There are time frames next to the woman. The building has a time span listed 330 years ago. And then on the other side, 1,575 bricks. And then at the bottom, beneath the hair braid, 25 twists, 70 braids, 50 locks. All terms that relate to hair, of course, but they also relate to a lot of other things. And this is what I have always really loved about Lorna Simpson's work. She puts together very straightforward elements in a picture and puts them together in a way, she doesn't finish the work for us. And this gets back to what Karen was saying about Simpson's work. She gives us all these elements and sort of leaves them for us to put together in more than one way. And in doing so, you, the viewer, become to some extent, maybe a small extent, but to some extent you become the author of the work as you bring your own experiences and associations and prejudices and stereotypes and cliches and everything else that goes on in our brains. We bring all of that to a work like this. And there's plenty to hold on to that we can all recognize together, you know, historical references and so forth. But there's also a very personal element to how you think about these words and pictures together and how you put them together as you look at the work. I should say this piece, Counting, is an additioned work. It's in more than one museum. It is in my museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's a very popular work, and I always am happy to have it on view. It's actually a large photogravure, and it is large. It's over 6 feet high. So it's actually, you might think of it as being the size of a human figure, and I think that was absolutely intentional for the artist. And there's a real figurative presence to this work. Now, Lorna Simpson, when she made this work, she wasn't so far out of graduate school. She attended the University of California at San Diego in the mid-1980s. And she came out of there as a star. I mean, it's sort of amazing how quickly she became known, and justifiably, because she really, at that point, was contributing very serious artworks to a larger conversation about conceptual photography and about photography and text, and also about documentary photography. And Southern California was really the hotbed for conversations around conceptual photography, beginning in as early as the 1960s and 70s, and certainly when Lorna Simpson was there. Southern California in general, and even more specifically San Diego. The artist John Baldessari, for instance, started out in San Diego. In the 60s, he started putting words and pictures together, often photographs. In his case, often in a very humorous way, quite different from Simpson, but very, very influential. And then in the 70s in San Diego, there was a group of artists really interested in documentary photography, but also in all of the problems, the political and philosophical dilemmas that documentary photography brings up. They're known as the San Diego Group. Sometimes Alan Sekula and Martha Rossler are the two most famous members of the group. Phil Steinmetz and Fred Lenidier are two others. And they had, over years, they had very serious conversations about the implications of documentary photography. How can you get at any objective truth with an image, which is always, even if it's taken from the world like a photograph, it's always a representation, and it's always an abstraction. It's always pulled from the world. And the four of those particular artists looked for many ways to get around this, sometimes introducing subjective qualities into the work to kind of foreground what was at stake in their efforts at documentary. And I'm just going to show you one example here. This is Martha Rossler. This is from her really famous series of montages called Bringing the War Home, which she made during the years of the Vietnam War. She was making them from 67 to about 72. And for most of them, she would take illustrations from magazines like Good Housekeeping or House Beautiful, and very slyly insert war imagery, Vietnam War imagery into them. And in this case, you see the two boys in their beautifully decorated bedroom for the early 70s. There's actually a war protester poster over the boy at the desk, and that's inserted by Rossler. This is a subtle example. Others are much more violent in the series.
And Peter, I just wanted to, sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to remind you to press play. That way the image can be a bit larger.
Oh, okay. Excuse me. Great. How does that work? Good. Thank you, Ash. So this is part of the context that Lorna Simpson went into when she moved to Southern California in the 80s to study photography. Now, she wasn't a student of these artists I was mentioned, but two of her mentors were Eleanor Antin and David Antin, a filmmaker and poet who were very close to this group of photographers. And there were just a lot of very heady conversations going on out west at this time about photography. And that really is an important context for Lorna Simpson. Carrie Mae Weems also went to the same graduate program a few years ahead of Simpson, and came out of it also just, guns blazing, making this extraordinary work. So it really, their accomplishments, I think, really speak to what an interesting place this was at that time. Now I'm going to show a very different artist, but also Southern Californian. This is Robert Heineken, who also experimented with montage and magazine imagery in the 60s, often including war protest imagery, among other subjects. But this is slightly different. This is a very witty, funny piece by him. It's a small series he did called TV Dinners that I've always been a fan of. And he basically took a photograph of a Swanson TV dinner and then printed it in a way, printed it on photographic paper, emulsion paper, and hand colored it, in this case in a very sloppy way, sort of like you'd experience the unsavory contents of a TV dinner. But then he printed these on shaped canvas. Before he hand colored them, he would print the image on shaped canvas and then paint it. And what he's doing here, it's a minor point, but he's sort of, you know, making the subject of the photograph, he's making the object into the shape of the subject of the photograph, which is what Lorna Simpson did with her fabric workshop piece, where you're walking on water, literally in the piece. So there's a very slight but a fun connection between these works in that way. And Heineken, who again was not one of Lorna Simpson's teachers, but he's also in this conversation that she was coming out of in the mid 80s when she made this extraordinary work that she was first known for. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about a different trajectory of experimental photography that Lorna Simpson is not associated with at all, but that I think relates to the fabric workshop and that perhaps did inform her thinking about materials, at least when she came to the fabric workshop. In the early 1970s, photography was just being accepted into the art world in terms of an art market for it and in terms of museums and universities teaching, accepting teachers of it. And there was a canon of photography. You know, you can think of people like Ansel Adams or Edward Weston. Now we think of it as very traditional black and white work, gelatin silver prints, usually very beautiful, meticulous prints, windows onto the world, they're sometimes called. And in addition to the group out in Southern California, these people who were questioning all of the assumptions behind work like Edward Weston's or Ansel Adams, there were a bunch of artists in many different parts of the country who were experimenting with materials because as many photo professors like to tell you, you can print a photograph on anything, actually. Material, textiles, glass, china, whatever you want. And you can also make a photograph out of many different things. And many artists started to experiment with alternative processes. That's the term that's used for this big grab bag of different kinds of photographs, which really came together in the 70s, but there's still a big alternative processes community in photography out there today. People who work with outmoded processes, old processes, or just are very experimental in what they make photographs of. One of my favorites is an artist named Betty Hahn. She's out in New Mexico. She's actually in her 80s now and was a great force in alternative processes. She taught first in Rochester, New York, and then out at the University of New Mexico for decades, and has always been very iconoclastic and experimental and very witty in her work. Also, there's a strong feminist element to her work, which is true of a lot of this alternative process photography. There's always political content and humor and a pretty strong element of feminism in a lot of it. And I think that lines up with Lorna Simpson in interesting ways. This example I'm showing you is called soft daguerreotype. And you'll have to try to be a photo geek with me for a moment. Daguerreotypes were the very first kinds of photographs that were invented in the 1830s. And they're unique images, they're under glass, they're very hard to look at. They always have to be in a case because they're so fragile. And you usually have to sort of tilt a daguerreotype back and forth in your hands to look at it because it's both a positive and a negative image. So it's really hard to look at a daguerreotype. And curators like me just go nuts about daguerreotypes. We love them. And they're small. And Betty Hahn in the 70s decided to make her own since she couldn't easily get a daguerreotype, and when she could get one, it was hard to see. She decided to make her own soft daguerreotypes out of fabric. And you see this one, she she basically photocopied an image of some grasses and then printed it on synthetic fabric and then made a big case. And what I love about this is it's much, much bigger than any real daguerreotype ever would be. It's like this big floppy pillow that you can open up and look at. So it's really kind of a joke, but it's also very beautiful and fun. And just to give you a further sense of Betty Hahn, who's not nearly as well known as I think she should be, this is another series she made that I love called the Lone Ranger series. And she made about, I think about 50 or 60 prints with this image. All the prints are different. They're all made by different processes. And as you see, she introduced lots of different colors and backgrounds, sort of like we can do on Zoom, but she was doing it in the 70s. And what she did, she just found a pretty bad stock Hollywood photo of the Lone Ranger and Tonto from the TV show of that time. And I think she picked a bad one on purpose. So you have the cactus that's right behind the Lone Ranger's head, making it a very goofy picture indeed. And she's obviously mocking the kind of, you know, uber masculinity that the Lone Ranger is posing here. And she just printed the image over and over and over again with all different processes. I think I heard her speak about it once, and she made a different image every day when she was on a residency. You know, just a very fun example of some work that was going on prior to Lorna Simpson. This is another example I love. This is the Rochester, New York-based artist Keith Schmitt. We just had a show of his work 2 years ago at our museum, curated by Amanda Bach. Really wonderful exhibition that gave him a lot of the notice that he has missed over the years. Keith Schmitt trained as a photographer, but he's primarily a book artist. He makes these unique artist books, and he's really into sewing and textile work. And he often combines them. And this is a piece he made. He also made mail art. He would make postcards to send to people and then turn them into pictures. And this is a self-portrait in front of his VW bus that he's very delicately hand colored and then stitched, as you can see. And stitching and sewing, as I just said, do show up in his work quite a lot. Another artist I want to mention is closer to home. Her name is Karen Janssen. She's one of Philadelphia's unsung heroines of alternative processes. She, in the early 70s, decided to recreate her entire home in photography. And she specifically chose cyanotypes, which are a very inexpensive and easy way to make pictures. You get this beautiful blue color with them, basically because you're using iron salts instead of silver to make your pictures, and iron salts turn blue. They're blueprints, right? Architects for years used this exact process to make cheap copies of their drawings and renderings of building plans. And there's a long history of cyanotype in photography. In fact, a woman in the 1840s, Anna Atkins, made some of the greatest cyanotypes of all time. So there's again, this kind of feminist history to this particular process, which I think appealed to Catherine. But in the 70s, she decided, you know, she was an artist, but she was also at home taking care of her family, and she decided to recreate her entire house on fabric, often stuffing pillows. She was actually married at the time to the artist Will Larson, who's also a great experimental artist. He just passed away last year. But you see that, you see what she did. She and her husband laid on their sheets to make one image that's on the bed, and she just photographed everything in the house and then recreated it at life size. This is a detail of the radio and a letter that she had received on the bedside stand. This piece, this room installation, I should say, called the Blue Room, is now owned by the Michener Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. So it is available to see nearby. And also, until recently, it was in the wonderful show about Philadelphia art in the 60s and 70s that Sid Sachs curated, and it was on view at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And this is another piece. So I only showed you Catherine's bedroom. She did this with every room in her house. And we, at my museum, we have this one tea set that I love. If you look carefully, you can even see her reflection in the sugar bowl of this tea set. And this is a three-dimensional pillow. It's like a big stuffed teapot tea set pillow that she made. And that's my last image. So of course, I could go on talking. I have plenty more to say, but I'm going to turn things over for a moment to Karen.
If you want, thank you, Peter. I really appreciate it. It's one of my favorite things to hear these comparisons and how to relate to one work with other artists. So I really appreciate that, and I hope we get to talk about that soon. And before we open up the conversation, I just wanted to hear a little bit from our Director of Education, Christina Roberts, who has the living, breathing memory of the residency at with Lorna Simpson. And so she's just going to share some stories and some images of that experience.
Hi, it's nice to see everyone. Thanks for joining us. I've been at the workshop a long time and have the pleasure of knowing a lot of moments that happened, especially with Lorna Simpson. When she came to the workshop in 1993 in the fall, we were still at our 1100 Vine Street location up on the 13th floor. And around this time that we invited Lorna, she was also invited to be part of the Whitney Museum at Philip Morris show with Thelma Golden, curated by Thelma Golden, who was the director at that time. So those two kind of opportunities dovetailed nicely, and it gave her a chance to really come to the workshop and experiment and think about the site-specific installation that she was going to make at the Whitney. And typical of that time, in that era, in the 90s, we would, whenever an artist would come to the fabric workshop, we would pull out all the stops and bring out actual artwork from archives and put it on the long print tables. And we would try to think about what the artist might be interested in seeing. And since Lorna Simpson's a photographer and interested in experimental processes, we brought out pieces like Martha Madigan, who's a local Philadelphia photographer, and she made the Goddess Cape back in the early days of the workshop. And Carrie Mae Weems is another example of, experimenting with photographic imagery, printing that on fabric. And Marianne Friel's here tonight, she might want to say something. And Shelley Bachman and Robert Whitman. And those were sort of the pieces that we had on these big long tables. And we were talking to Lorna and trying to warm her up. And I think Virgil was photographing this situation, and just asking her, like, what was she interested in? And she said that she was really interested in a rug piece or a floor piece. And she expressed that she wanted it to be soft, something uncomplicated. And we said, kind of like a rug, like a woven rug. And she said, no, I don't know. I'm open to anything. So we're like, well, let's go have lunch. So a lot of times when, you sit down and have lunch, wonderful conversations happen. So we sat there with Kippy and Pam Vanderswan, her project coordinator, who was also a photographer. She went to Tyler. Let's see, other people, Kelly Mitchell, Sue Patterson, Liz McIlvain. These were all like the studio project coordinators at the time. So we were all sitting around talking about fabric, and felt came up. And so someone jumped up, and we just had boatloads of samples. Like, you pull out drawers and we have like, just like all these samples fall out, all different kinds of felt. And I think Cynthia Porter brought over this big bag of felt samples that were all attached to their little cards. And Lorna was like, wow. So she threw some on the floor and she stepped on them, and she was like, oh, I like this, so that was it. So there was no turning back. So that's kind of how felt happened over lunch. And so let's see, we were, she liked all these are industrial felts. So they were all different kinds of thicknesses and densities and different colors. And she was wondering how we could print on these things. And so we, Pam ordered industrial felt from Buffalo Felt Company, big rolls of 3/4 inch felt. So this stuff is industrial. It's just amazing stuff and super expensive. And we tested printing on it and everything with the halftone. And like Karen mentioned, Lorna came with this image in mind that she wanted to experiment with. It was an image of waves. And of course, Pam Vanderswan was just like a mastermind of, figuring out how to take like a little image and blowing it up really big and putting it onto several different screens and printing it onto the fabric and getting it out the door just in time for the Whitney show. It was like, a feat in itself. But a little bit about felt itself. As a textile, it's one of the oldest known textiles, and it's produced by matting and condensing. So if some of you have done, you need hot water and soap and agitation. And felt fiber is a protein fiber, and it's very much like human hair. In a microscopic level, it has little tiny scales. And through heat and compression and moisture, these little scales will open up and then they mat together. So it's an unwoven fabric, and it's uncomplicated, it's soft, and it was perfect for Lorna. And some things that you might not know about industrial felt are that it's used in piano hammer keys and buffing wheels, and even in Zippo lighters. There's a tiny little sliver of felt from the Buffalo Felt Company. So thanks.
Thank you, Christina. I appreciate that. I think it's important to think about the qualities of felt when you're thinking about artist projects and what drew Lorna to it. And of course, and we saw with the image that Peter led with, counting, that hair was really important in some of the imagery that Lorna was picking. And so this kind of overlap of conceptual underpinnings is really interesting to think about. And I don't know if she thought about hair and felt together, but I just love thinking about that connection as she, as an artist, was trying to think about embodiment and how to imply the body. So that's really interesting connection. I appreciate it. So we have about 20 minutes left. And I wondered, Peter, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and then maybe I'll ask you a question, we can open it up, is the idea of experimental practices in photography. Can you talk about the relationship of photography and the larger contemporary art world, and what did why were we going into this experimental processes way with photography, and how does that relate to the relationship between photography and contemporary art?
So the relationship between photography writ large and contemporary art is complicated, and I would say that it's a piecemeal relationship, right? Because photography is so much bigger than the contemporary art world that it contributes to, right? It's this mass medium that shows up in so many parts of our lives. And then even within the art world, the traditional photography that I alluded to, I mentioned Edward Weston and Ansel Adams as examples. That is kind of a subset of the modern art world, and even the contemporary art world today, that often doesn't overlap with broader conversations in contemporary art. And it would take 15 philosophers to talk about why that is and how it happens or doesn't happen. But the fact of the matter is that certain artists who use photography, certain very committed photographers, do find themselves becoming really important to that broader conversation in contemporary art. And Lorna Simpson is one of those. Carrie Mae Weems, I mentioned. The other artists I mentioned who came out of that California context are all similar examples. Cindy Sherman's an unrelated example, somebody who was working on the East Coast. And the alternative gang that I mentioned, they certainly are not as well known as those other artists. And that's one reason I like to talk about them, because I think that the big broad field of alternative processes in photography is really fascinating. There's a lot of great stuff that comes out of it, but it is its own kind of weird subset in the art world. I don't want to try too hard to tie these two groups together. I think that the Fabric Workshop is a nexus where those different threads, no pun intended, do come together. And aside from that, any artist is going to think really hard about the materials that they're using to make work, right? And in Lorna Simpson's case, her decision to use felt does seem to relate to some of the imagery that she used of hair and also of clothing. The robes and dresses that people wear are often really important in her work. And I also, she certainly studied with filmmakers, as I mentioned. Babette Mangold is another really well-known filmmaker that she studied with. So film, I think, has always been an important background in her work. And the way that the pieces she made subsequently to the workshop, right? So the wonderful public sex series that you talked about, Karen, was work that she made right after her residency at the Fabric Workshop. And that's the first time she takes this new material, felt, and starts to run with it and make new work. And she's made a lot of felt pieces since then. And often they're large and pieced together. And to me, they actually sometimes resemble film screens. And I have no idea if that's something she thought about, but I certainly think there's kind of a material relationship there. And she also has made some beautiful films herself.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think also about those panels as fragments, you know, this idea that she fragments stories so that she implies or implicates us to complete the story or to be accountable to how to fix that story, I guess, in some cases. And what's also interesting, I was reading so in preparation for this talk, by some information by curator named Kenitra Fletcher in Houston, and she was talking about the idea of ambiguity as resistance. And I really thought about felt being this, you know, this kind of soft, and it softens the sound, but it also is kind of an in-between material, and that Lorna Simpson's work also has this ambiguous result. You don't really know what it means, but I think in that act of resistance, she is implicating us to think about the bodies and certainly the African-American experience and the contemporary African-American experience. And so I really wanted to think about that idea of ambiguity as resistance too. I don't know if that's something that you're thinking about, Peter, but I read it and I thought it was beautiful. But at the same time, we only have 14 minutes left. So I would love to know what everyone else responded to between Peter's talk and Christina's talk and my overview of the exhibition. It would be lovely even if you had thoughts about photography or what you're doing today. You know, the idea of Zoom is just that we're all here together sharing our thoughts. And so please feel free to I guess, put your hand up. I think that's the way we're doing it.
Yeah, I'm remembering from that, I think I was in California when that was unfolding, so I don't have many memories of the process, but I do remember the exhibition. And at the very end, the far wall, there was a tiny, was it a film? A pitcher of water pouring water. So I just wanted to get I assume that's in the current exhibition and that it's part of the piece. So I wanted to hear more about that.
It is a part of the piece, thank you. And so when you walk into the space, you hear the sound of trickling water as well. So it kind of completes that ambient experience to the installation. And you're right, it's just a small little video. And so one of the challenges when you're putting a collection show back together is how to recreate that technology. And at the time, that technology was ahead of its time. And it's really, you're right, it's just a series of words referencing different bodies of water or how water gets used. Like there's sentences with the word water and then just this picture. And for me, I made the association of the vessel and the body and thinking about that association. But there wasn't a lot of research done on the connection, but it just felt right to the embodiment and the vessel.
I'll just jump in and say that water imagery shows up in Lorna Simpson's work in pictures like the one I showed from the late 80s and early 90s. There's one piece, I'm going to forget the title, but you see a woman from behind and she's holding two vessels of water. One is a pitcher and one is a plastic bottle. And she seems to be balancing with them. And, you know, in addition to thinking about the body as a vessel, I think she always brings us back to thinking about labor, the labor that a body does. Whether it's a woman's body or an African-American body or any other kind of body. And that's another theme.
You don't think the felt refers to Joseph Beuys? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hadn't even thought of Joseph Beuys, Marion, but that's a great question because Joseph Beuys, of course, made these really monumentally important artworks in the 60s with felt and fat. And some other elements. And I just hadn't even thought about that when we were talking about this, but it's a great point. Karen, do you have anything you want to throw in about Beuys?
No, that is a great reference. I think I hadn't thought about that. That's really, I mean, I often wonder, and certainly, you know, Lorna was definitely not working in isolation. So I often wonder about how artists, you know, reference other artists in the work that they make. And so I think there was, it sounds also that story about being at lunch and like you just wanted something on the floor and then felt came up, seems right. But yeah, you never know what an artist sees and how they kind of digest that information. But it
Well,
makes
then the other thing I was thinking,
Another artist would be Robert Morris, was also using film from.
Sure, that's right. Well, and I was going to say that Joseph Beuys, of course, his narrative about his use of felt was had to do with his experience as a soldier in World War II and the uniform that he had. So there's that kind of historical reference. But Judith, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Excuse me.
No. I was just saying, you know.
well, I also want to say she's married to James Casimir, who do these amazing, well, I don't know what they're called, Peter, but they had water in them. And he would make these things and then photograph them.
Right.
You know what I'm talking about? Or
I don't know the specific pieces that you're referencing. I can't picture them, but I know James Casimir's work, of course.
Awesome. And I also saw that Mary asked a question.
Yeah, hi.
You'd like to share?
Yeah, Peter, I was thinking too about Joseph Beuys, and I was thinking about the difference though to Lorna Simpson, and I could be wrong on this, but I think Beuys, it came out that some of his narrative was made up. And when I think about, when looking at Lorna Simpson's work, like she leaves the narrative so open because she's, like you said, trying to engage us as being authors. And I'm not, I see that maybe is a little bit different to his. I
think it's completely different, and that's a great point, Mary. Again, to get back to the specific context that Lorna Simpson came out of with graduate school, where she was focused on photography and its traditions, and she was thinking about documentary photography not just as a category, but as an idea that was really problematic, right? Because there's always a subjective person making the documentary picture, and they bring their politics and their views and their prejudices to the imagery. So one of the reasons that Lorna Simpson leaves everything so open in her pictures and makes us do some of the work is to get us to recognize that kind of subjectivity, and that really relates to the long debates about Joseph Beuys's narrative, his own personal narrative, which he did fictionalize, and that's one of the points that somebody like Lorna Simpson would make. Like everything's a fiction, and so you have to really work with any image to kind of pull something like truth out of it.
Yeah, great, thank you.
I'd also like to share that the exhibition is open, but it will be open again as we all figure out how to safely return to work and to museums, that we've extended the exhibition. So if this conversation has excited you and you didn't get a chance to see it, we hope to welcome you back to the Fabric Workshop. And we've extended the exhibition through the mid-October to October 11th. So I hope that you can see the work in person and hear the sounds of the water. It was a really great opportunity to, again, dig into the collection and also lean on the expertise of Peter, who I reached out to early to think about the context of photography and what that means. So, but it doesn't have to be any questions. If you have any thoughts about narrative and photography or short stories or anything, we're happy to hear them.
I had an opportunity to see it, luckily in person before we were in the lockdown, and I do remember the video at the end, and I found that really powerful and provocative. And I was wondering if you had any more background on the thought process behind that, because I don't remember it specifically, but I remember there were quite a number of images all dealing with water, but they were all very different, and some of them were funny or sexual, and it was just a very interesting video.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of information on it, and I don't know if Christina Roberts, you have any more information on the video, but what I was also struck by was the size of the screen and how it makes your body behave differently. So by all intents and purposes, you're walking through this kind of large scale immersive installation, and you're asked to kind of zone in on this small little screen with all these words, and it's kind of this free association moment. So you have this kind of experiential understanding of water, and then you have this all your other senses are engaged. And so I just thought that was a really thoughtful way of thinking about how a viewer walks through space, but still keeping the same motif and addressing all the senses all at once. But I don't have any research on it. I don't know if you found anything, Christina Roberts?
Well, I heard an interview with Lorna and Thelma Golden, and the work was so new at the time, and Lorna was like, I'm really not, she wasn't ready to really delve into it and talk about it, but Thelma was, and but it's a loop of 5 different images, and I know that it goes in this loop, and I think she was just being really experimental at that time and trying to put together, she was thinking about felt and printing and floor installation and what else could she put into this space, the Philip Morris gallery space, and she made the walls smaller, and I think she was just really, she just kept thinking what could she do to animate the space, and yeah, that was kind of how the conversation went.
Yeah, I agree. I also think, are we sharing it? Oh, I also think that it was in that video that I saw of Thelma Golden and Lorna Simpson, what's so cool to watch is that this nervousness of not knowing how you feel about the work. And you can see it in the video, and it really does capture some of the magic that happens at the fabric workshop. And then of course, to have it in our collection, you capture this moment that was never really replicated in the same way again. She certainly learned a lot and then distilled it in different ways over the next decades, as Peter said, but this was just kind of a chance to try and to do things with different materials and different ways of thinking about the visitor walking through and printing and all this kind of thing. So it's really nice to see this nervousness on an artist's face, because we know it, that you're like, I don't know how I feel about it, but then to have it and to be able to put it on view decades later and say, look at this important moment and this turning point moment. So I just wanted to add that. Do you have anything you'd like to share at the end, Peter?
I'm really interested by the size of the video, and I have a question. Are the 2 little white lights that we see at the end of the installation, those are the video screens? Wow, okay. I actually have not seen the show yet, so I'm very excited to do that. So they really are tiny. And has she worked on that scale since then, Lorna Simpson? Does anybody know? Has she made videos that small? Because her films are often very, very beautiful, and they incorporate a lot of the same imagery that you see in other work that she's done.
I haven't seen anything at that scale, and it makes me feel like it is such an experiment that I don't even know. And this is me projecting and making up history, so just bear with me in this narrative. But like, what does it? Maybe it was something that was on hand, in the very spirit of the fabric workshop. Like, this was here, let's try that, and maybe that was what the size was. Who knows? And I think that that's kind of cool to think about too. It was really interesting to find that technology again. I'll say that. So I don't know if it was went the way of beta, just didn't last, but yeah, it was, it's a really cool scale.
I will observe that when you look at Lorna Simpson's pieces from the 90s and 2000s after the workshop residency, often her films are accompanied by still images that are printed on felt. And that was one reason that I was thinking about screens as maybe, something she had in mind when she made those prints. But there's something very beautiful about seeing imagery not exactly repeated, but sort of represented in these 2 different ways. And to get back to what we were saying about the beauty of the felt prints, they also look a lot like photogravures or engravings, right? Felt has such depth to it and dark inkiness that you really get that kind of toothy, wonderful, deep immersion in the image in Lorna Simpson's felt pieces.
I asked Peter if you knew when she started making films. Like, was she already making films when she made this, or was this sort of a precursor?
My understanding that she was making films before that. Is that right, Peter?
Yeah, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong mute button to unmute myself. But, I don't know the precise answer, Marianne. She certainly engaged with filmmaking when she was still a student. And I think probably filmmaking, I'm going to guess, has been an interest all the way through. But I think her first big film piece was in 2001, she made a film called Easy to Remember, which I actually really love. And it's just a bunch of different people humming the same jazz tune, which is titled Easy to Remember. And she just focuses on their lips. So you get this dissonance and harmony all together. in this piece, which also obviously incorporates sound. And that's one of the works where at another point in time she made a felt piece that relates to it. But I think film is important all the way through. You see it in the public sex series. I mean, she references the John Waters film with Divine, but those are very filmic pictures, right? They're almost like stills from a movie, and the text operates in the same way. Which I should say is really different from the way she used text before that. And for instance, in the image I started with, where she's putting words and images together in a way that makes everything more charged. With the public sex series, she's sort of illustrating the pictures with the words, which is an interesting way to go.
Thank you, Peter. This is it. This was the fastest hour that I've experienced since shelter in place, I have to admit. So thank you for this lively dialogue. It was really lovely to share this exhibition with everyone. And Peter, I appreciate your insights and sharing other artists who may have worked in the same way, or just on kind of these great comparisons. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank everyone for joining us here today on this first day of May. I appreciate you showing up. I appreciate your attention to this kind of important moment, and that it is our first Zoom meeting and Zoom event here at Fabric Workshop. Today also marks something really important for the Fabric Workshop, and that is a match campaign. And I just wanted to spend a minute just talking to you a little bit about a match campaign. If you've ever thought about becoming a member, if you'd like to support more programs for the Fabric Workshop, our board has generously stepped up and is doing a matching campaign with us. So everything that you donate doubles thanks to our board. And I would love to increase our membership. I'd love to do more events like this, and your contribution would go a long way. It runs through June 30th. And like I said, it's a match campaign. So if you give $1, you actually give $2. But it also means if you join as a member, instead of getting a 1-year membership, you get a 2-year membership. So we appreciate your attention to that. And we also appreciate you coming here tonight. So enjoy your weekend. And thank you very much for joining us.